On the night of January 13th, 2012, Captain Francesco Schettino steered the Costa Concordia, 114,000 tons of steel, glass and 15 decks of passengers, toward the rocky coast of Giglio Island. This was not a navigation error, it was a salute, a maritime tradition: pass close to shore, sound the horn, wave to the islanders. The captain had done it before, but this time, the rocks were closer than the charts on his bridge suggested they should be. The Costa Concordia was not a small vessel making a courtesy pass. She was a floating resort, longer than 3 football fields, taller than a 17-story building, carrying more than 4,000 passengers and crew. Her bridge was equipped with GPS, radar, electronic charts and depth sounders. Every rock within miles was mapped. Every hazard was known. And yet the decision to deviate from the planned route, to steer towards shallow water for a gesture, was made by a single man in a moment, without formal consultation. What happened next was not a sudden catastrophe. It was a slow-motion collision of human tradition and engineering limits. The ship struck a submerged reef. Water flooded the hull. The Concordia listed, grounded, and came to rest on her side against the rocks. Visible from shore, illuminated by emergency lights, a 17-deck monument to a single decision. 32 people died. And the question that followed was not whether the rocks were charted. They were. It was why a captain with all that information chose to ignore it. The Costa Concordia was not a ship in the traditional sense. It was a 17-deck floating resort, 952 feet long, displacing 114,000 tons. 4 diesel generators powered her through the Mediterranean at 21 knots. Inside, 13 passenger decks, 5 restaurants, 4 swimming pools, a casino, a theatre seating a 1,500. More than 4,200 people lived aboard during a typical cruise, passengers and crew combined, a population larger than many of the Italian coastal towns she passed. Controlling that city fell to a bridge crew of 4, captain, first officer, helmsman, and a deck officer monitoring the integrated navigation system. GPS receivers, electronic charts, radar, gyro compass, all feeding a central display. The system knew the ship's position to within 10 meters. It knew every charted rock, every depth contour, every restricted zone. It could sound alarms when the planned route crossed danger, but the system had no authority. Every decision, course, speed, proximity to shore, required a human command, and on the evening of January 13th, 2012, the captain gave one. Giglio Island rises from the Tyrrhenian Sea, 12 miles off the Tuscan coast, a granite outcrop crowned with a medieval village, its eastern shore a series of rocky promontories and shallow bays. The seabed drops away steeply on the north and west, but the eastern flank is different. Submerged reefs extend hundreds of meters from shore, fingers of rock reaching into the shipping lanes, charted and named on every navigational chart since the 19th century. The reef that would tear open the Concordia was marked on Italian Hydrographic Institute Chart 6D. A cluster of rocks labelled Le Scole, depth soundings showing the seabed rising from 40 meters to less than 10 in the span of a ship's length. The chart showed a clear safety corridor. Vessels were to pass no closer than 500 meters from the island's eastern points. Every captain sailing these waters had access to the chart. Every captain knew the rocks were there. The plan was announced casually. Around 9:15 that evening, Captain Schettino told his bridge crew they would pass close to Giglio, close enough for the islanders to see the ship, close enough to sound the horn. One of the officers on the bridge was from Giglio. The salute was a gesture for him, and for a retired captain who lived on the island, it was framed as a courtesy, not a deviation. No formal risk assessment, no written alteration to the voyage plan. Just an announcement, 15 minutes before the turn. The helmsman, Jacob Rusli Bin, an Indonesian officer with years of experience, later testified that he questioned the proximity. He asked how close they would pass. The answer he received was vague, close enough to see the island clearly, close enough for the salute to matter. Rusli Bin understood what that meant. He also understood the hierarchy of the bridge. A helmsman executes orders. He does not overrule the captain. So when the command came to alter course towards shore, he turned the wheel. What allowed the manoeuvre to proceed was not a failure of technology. Every system on the bridge was functioning. It was a failure of culture. The bridge of a cruise ship operates on a gradient of authority. The captain commands, the officers advise, the helmsman steers. That gradient works when the captain integrates information and weighs risk. It fails when the captain announces a decision as settled, and the crew interprets questioning as insubordination. No alarm sounded. No automated system intervened. The ship turned toward the rocks because a human hierarchy permitted it. At 21:34, Schettino ordered the helmsman to begin the turn back toward open water, but the Concordia was still doing 15 knots, nearly full cruising speed, and she was less than 500 meters from the charted reef line. Modern cruise ships do not pivot like speedboats. At that mass and velocity, the turning radius stretches across hundreds of meters of ocean. The helmsman later testified that he questioned the timing. Schettino told him to execute the order. At 21:45, 11 minutes into the turn, the port side of the hull struck Lascaux Reef. The impact was not a collision in the cinematic sense. No explosion, no sudden lurch. Passengers in the dining rooms felt a shudder, heard a scraping sound that lasted several seconds as the ship's momentum dragged 50 meters of steel plating across submerged granite. The bridge alarms did not immediately indicate catastrophic damage, but below the waterline a 53-meter gash had been torn through the hull, longer than the width of a city block. The chief engineer reached the bridge 3 minutes after impact and reported flooding in multiple compartments: engine room 5, generator room 2, the bow thruster room. Schettino asked if the watertight doors had closed. They had. But the gash was so long that it breached 5 separate compartments simultaneously, and seawater was pouring in faster than the pumps could manage. The ship's subdivision system, designed to contain flooding to isolated zones, was overwhelmed from the first minute. The impact tore a gash 174 feet long down the port side, a ragged wound that opened 5 watertight compartments to the sea at once. Modern cruise ships are subdivided into sealed zones, each with its own watertight door, so that flooding in one compartment cannot spread. The Concordia was designed to stay afloat with any 2 compartments breached, but this was not 2. This was 5, in a continuous line, and the water came in fast. Thousands of tons per minute, flooding the engine rooms, the generator spaces, the lower passenger decks. Within minutes, the ship began to list, tilting to port as the flooded compartments pulled her down on one side. The watertight doors, designed to contain flooding, could not stop water from climbing upward through stairwells, elevator shafts, and ventilation ducts as the ship rolled. Each degree of list opened new pathways for the sea. By the time the Concordia grounded against the rocks, her starboard side wedged onto a submerged ledge, she was listing 20 degrees and still taking on water. The assumption, the engineering promise, was that compartmentalization would contain the damage, that the ship would settle level and stay afloat long enough for rescue. But the Concordia's hull was breached along its length, not across it. The watertight bulkheads ran athwart ships, side to side, and could not stop water spreading fore and aft through the open gash. The ship did not sink. But she did not stay level either. She rolled onto her side, and the engineering that should have saved her became irrelevant the moment the list exceeded 15 degrees. The problem was, no one on the bridge immediately declared an emergency. For 13 minutes after impact, Captain Schettino did not order abandon ship. He did not sound the general alarm. Passengers wandered the tilting corridors in evening wear, confused by the angle of the floor, asking crew members what had happened. The ship's public address system played pre-recorded announcements in Italian, English, French, German, and Spanish. A technical problem. Please return to your cabins. But the Concordia was already listing 8 degrees to port, and every minute the angle increased. At 22:10, 25 minutes after the collision, the Italian Coast Guard received the first distress call. Not from the bridge, but from a passenger using a mobile phone. When the Coast Guard contacted the Concordia, Schettino downplayed the situation. A blackout, he said, nothing more. The ship was now listing 20 degrees. Lifeboats on the starboard side hung too far from the hull to board safely. Lifeboats on the port side pressed against the superstructure. Impossible to launch. The evacuation that should have been orderly became improvised. By 23 hours, the ship had grounded against the rocks of Giglio, her port side submerged, her starboard side towering above the waterline at a 60-degree angle. Passengers climbed rope ladders down the hull, jumped into the black water, or waited on the high side for rescue helicopters. 32 people died, 27 passengers and 5 crew. Most drowned in flooded cabins or were trapped below decks as the ship rolled. The evacuation took over 6 hours. The last survivor was pulled from the wreck at 03:00 the following morning. By dawn on January 14th, the Concordia had come to rest on her starboard side against a submerged granite shelf off Giglio's eastern shore. Half submerged, half exposed, listing at 70 degrees. The ship's port side loomed above the waterline like a beached whale, her red hull paint stark against the Mediterranean blue. Salvage engineers arriving by helicopter that morning confronted a problem no one had solved before. A 114,000-ton cruise ship lying on its side in shallow water, filled with seawater, fuel and debris, pressed against rock. She could not be towed. She could not be cut apart in place. And she could not remain. The wreck was leaking fuel, blocking the harbour and desecrating a marine sanctuary. The engineering problem was threefold. First, stability. The wreck was balanced precariously on rock. Any shift in weight or buoyancy could send her sliding into deeper water, making recovery impossible. Second, environmental containment. 2,400 tons of heavy fuel oil remained in the ship's tanks, and every day of delay increased the risk of a catastrophic spill. Third, structural integrity. The hull had been designed to float upright, not to lie on its side for months, while subjected to wave action, tidal stress, and its own crushing weight. The Concordia was disintegrating slowly, and every week made the problem harder. The question facing the salvage consortium was not whether to act, but whether any solution existed at all. The problem was unprecedented. A 114,000-ton cruise ship lying on its starboard side in shallow water, half submerged against granite ledges. No salvage company had ever attempted to rotate a wreck this massive back upright. The technique they chose was called parbuckling, a method as old as sailing itself, used for centuries to right capsized wooden ships by pulling them upright with ropes and leverage. But the Concordia was not a wooden hull. It was a 17-deck steel city, and the engineers would need to rotate it using synchronized hydraulic winches, 36 steel cables anchored into the seabed, and enormous hollow sponsons welded to the port side to provide buoyancy as the hull rolled. The risk was that any miscalculation, uneven cable tension, a sponson failure, shifting ballast, could tear the hull apart or send it sliding down the underwater slope into deeper water, where it would be unrecoverable. The engineers modelled every phase digitally, rehearsed the cable sequences, and installed sensors across the wreck to monitor stress in real time. On September 16, 2013, 19 months after the grounding, the operation began. It would take 19 hours of continuous synchronized pulling to rotate the Concordia through 65 degrees. No one had ever parbuckled anything close to this scale. If the hull fractured mid-rotation, the wreck would be lost. The rotation began at dawn. 36 hydraulic winches, half on the island, half on an anchored barge platform, pulled the steel cables in synchronized increments, each winch monitored by computer to ensure no single cable bore more than its rated load. The sponsons welded to the starboard side provided buoyancy as the hull lifted off the rocks, but the margin was narrow. If the wreck rolled too fast, inertia could snap the cables. Too slow, and the shifting weight inside the hull might tear the weakened steel. Engineers advanced in half-degree increments, pausing after each pull to let the structure settle. 19 hours later, the Concordia rested upright on the seabed platform. No longer a wreck on its side, but a hull that could be refloated. Over the following year, salvage crews sealed the gash with steel plates, pumped out the water, and attached flotation caissons to the hull. In July 2014, 20 months after the parbuckling, tugs towed the Concordia away from Giglio for the last time. The largest object ever moved by human engineering had been returned to the sea, not as a ship, but as proof that even catastrophic failure could be reversed with patience, precision, and acceptance of the scale of the task. The Concordia disaster began with a gesture, a captain's decision to steer close and wave at an island. What followed revealed that no amount of engineering can protect a ship from the judgment of the person commanding it. The hull was subdivided, the charts were accurate, the technology functioned, but the bridge made a choice. and 32 people died because tradition overrode data. Ships are only as safe as the decisions made on the bridge.